That's certainly a real possibility, I agree.
So back in this time, with education being kind of scarce or so, based on the way that West King's ruling, they kind of
Yeah, go ahead. No, I don't disagree with it.
point people into the direction that you should probably follow because you're probably not fit for it.
Sure. But here's an anomaly to that. I think that's good thinking. Here's the anomaly. Out of that lack of education grows the libertarian philosophy. Of the few that are educated, and it appeals to the uneducated, more so than the divine right of kings appeals to the uneducated.
Of course, Thomas Hobbes' theory of the Leviathan is a version that's utopian, where everybody's happy and the ruler wants what's best for the people. Yet, doesn't factor up. Yet, when his theory would put into practice leads to a darker side of the theory, which means like Big Brother states or like in 1984, Big Brother is always watching you, government sponsored torture and all that stuff. Well, it could, I mean, it could work if, like the founding fathers said, if men were angels and men were holy, and they could do nothing wrong, then no government would be necessary. Which is true, because if we were perfect, then there would be no need for government, there would no need for laws. The reason why we have, like you said, the reason why we have laws is because people don't follow them. People will do stuff that hurts people, right?
Okay. Well, let's regress back into Hobbes for a minute. Hobbes comes out of a very violent time. Hobbes's assumption is that people by nature are violent and need to be controlled. Locke proposes that government by nature is violent and it needs to be controlled. So both these men are born at a time and have lived through horrible wars. I mean, more horrible wars come after them, but lived through horrible wars. And so the question is, how do we stop the warring? One makes the assumption that people are evil, we need to control people, and the other says, no, it's governments that start wars. People don't start wars. If we go to war again, it's not because, a whole bunch of us get together and say, oh, the heck with the government, we're going to go start a war. Government starts wars. However, governments are people in power. So maybe there's something there that Hobbes is recognizing that we need to look at. Maybe there's something about the human being, because he only describes our relationship to nature. He doesn't describe nature's relationship to itself. That's why I wanted to start with nature. You look at nature. Nature is pretty much harmonious for the most part, the living part of nature, although it does have times when it's violent. Procreation, territory, and food. But we fight with each other over ideas. We're virulent about it. I couldn't even begin to imagine how many hundreds of million people over the 8,000 years of recorded human history have been killed over ideas, disagreements about ideas.
I think the two theories can coincide more than it's being described, because it's not really a thing about which agent is equal between individuals versus the government. It's more on when somebody has the power, for example, in Hobbes' description, where man has the power not only to have ultimate freedom where I can kill you, you can kill me, and there's no safety between that. He's scared of the power being invested in the individual because they have that freedom, whereas Locke is scared of the government being given that freedom because government's simply the transferring of that power from the people to a
Ruler,
yeah.
whoever, yeah.
It's really just, instead of talking about which agent's worse, it's talking about where the power ought to be invested.
Mm-hmm. So how do we work our way through the garden, people? The divine right of kings gives us the libertarian philosophy, really. Only instead of one person having all authority, it should be all people having authority. Hobbes doesn't disagree with that. He just thinks that we should then invest our authority in a single authority for peace and for welfare. Even if the king gets it wrong once in a while, whoever the Leviathan is gets it wrong once in a while, it's still better than letting us all just run wild according to our own, everybody doing what's right in their own eye. But the premise that he makes is what I want you to think about and what I'm challenging. Are we really that evil? Are we really that bad? Are we really that uncontrolled? I mean, use the classroom as a situation. There's obviously a Leviathan here, looking out for everybody's welfare. Every day you walk through that day, you get an A for that door, you get an A for the day. I'll do everything I can to help you keep it, but you have to work at it to keep it. but I'm in charge. Someone came up to me just last class and said, okay, so I didn't follow the rule. I took the quiz before any of the lectures, and can I get a do-over? And the Leviathan had to say, well, I have a rule to keep peace. Everybody gets a free pass every semester. You want to use your pass up now or later? Because everybody gets one. And that seems to keep order. Everybody feels like, well, that's fair. Everybody makes mistakes. That's a way to correct a mistake.
I think Hobbes makes the wrong assumption for nature. I believe nature is very tribalistic in its own sense, going back throughout recorded human history. It's not necessary that people band together to form one person to have one power. They band together for their own good, and that's how they evolve. And I also don't think it's inherently a bad thing to have people invest their own powers and have their own self-interest, even though it could lead to them killing each other, because at least the alternative is slightly worse. Even though you may have ultimate chaos, having the people have their own power is still more important than investing it in a Leviathan.
A single person, yeah. And when you look at, that's good, I like that. And when you look at the evolution of libertarianism, in our particular example, we chose a republic, not a democracy. And a republic, therefore, has representatives. And of course, they're invested with power of the people. We elect them. And we can discharge them or we can recharge them again either way we want to. It's not a system that necessarily works to everybody's pleasure, everybody's benefit. So, what's your first name again? Brad. So what Brad said has a lot of force. Brandon has a lot of force. The people do invest their power in representatives. Whether we do it in our system, we do it in a parliamentarian system, there are other ways that the system could work out. But Locke's point of view is, but at the end, the power must reside with the people. Because their self-interest is the guiding interest. If you don't have that, then you must trust in the guiding interests of the Leviathan, that they'll put your peace and your welfare at least on an equal footing with their own. The security seems to be when we just suspend but not surrender. You hear the difference? So when you give your vote to someone, in a sense you suspend your authority because you've invested it in them, but you don't surrender it. That's why you can bring them back or choose not to vote for them. Sometimes we have things like recalls or whatever. So there is a positive in banding together. It provides for stability. It provides for access to resources. It provides for protection. It provides for a system of justice. That's what this course is about. What system will give us the greatest benefit? Whether it's the authoritarian system that Hobbes talks about, the Leviathan, and he makes some interesting arguments that can be embraced. And Locke makes some too. Aristotle, 2,300 years ago, he examined all forms of government that he was aware of. You know, the one he thought would be the worst was democracy. You know why he thought democracy would be the worst? He said within a short period of time, special interest groups would take over the whole show. What a bright cookie that was. So what we're doing this week and for the next couple, we're just going to explore some possibilities, but we have to explore the underlying factors. Are people really that evil that we can't govern ourselves, even if we moderate it and ask people to represent us and to rule, I don't want to say over us, but for us? How much power do we give them? Does the ultimate power really reside with us? Can we remove some power? Can we remove some people? Or is Hobbes right? In order to have complete stability, we need to accept the fact that we need to have an absolute authority. However, for him, and I'll explain now what covenant means, it's through a covenant relationship rather than through a contractual relationship. In a contractual relationship, your interests are represented, and your interests alone. In a covenant relationship, all interests are represented. Everybody is represented equally. So when all the people invest through a covenant in the Leviathan literally takes their cause on as if it's the Leviathan's own. That's why peace and welfare becomes the centerpiece. That a real authoritarian who rules under Hobbesian terms would always put the people's peace and welfare first. Now, when that doesn't happen, and they made reference to it in the film, well, the people still need to be real cautious, because once you overthrow the authority, you have, for Hobbes, his assumption, the state of nature, war against all. And he thinks that's the worst state to go into. So he even put up with some bad moves or whatever from Leviathan, because the alternative is the raw state of nature that he says is just totally incompatible with human living. Okay, do we kind of, any questions at all? Okay. Once again. So the state of nature under the following conditions, full-scale conflict between people is inevitable. These are his presumptions. If we don't accept them, then we don't accept his theory, at least in part. A war of all against all based on competition for scarce resources, people's opinions, personal power depends on what others think of him. Now, Hobbes acknowledges, even in a state of nature, people need to gather together to make provision for themselves, and so it becomes a power thing. We call it A-types. A-type personalities tend to be the people in charge. They tend to rise to the top, and we tend to invest our trust in them that they would represent us in a way that's at least conducive to our welfare. So Hobbes sees this. It's whether it gets caught up into the divine right of kings or whether we have to have a system that he believes is more conducive to everybody's welfare. Fear which dictates self-preservation in the battle for scarce resources. The rationale for his conclusion, given a scarcity of necessary objects in fear of and competition with other people to behave differently, is to place oneself at a disadvantage and perhaps to even engineer one's own destruction. It only takes a few ruthless, untrustworthy people in the state of nature to force everyone else to be constantly on guard. People are able to learn from experience. One thing experience teaches is that when you let down your guard to the wrong person at the wrong time, the consequences can be disastrous, even deadly. Two human faculties are sources of hope. One is reason, which includes the ability to learn from experience. The state of nature is the result of the way people behave. So if we understand the state of nature, we can move beyond it. Number two, fear of violent death. Obsessed with the threat of others, people recognize no limits in pursuit of scarcity and the objects of their desires. The laws of nature are rules for self-preservation. The state of nature is intolerable because of its absence of security. If everyone would recognize limits and refrain from attacking other people, all would be better off. This is what Cassandra referenced. If we all followed the law, we wouldn't need the law. But obviously we don't all follow the law, so we need the law. The individual must be willing to make whatever, this is key now, the individual must be willing to make whatever sacrifices are necessary to leave the situation for the security of civil society, of a social contract. If you don't want to live in a state of constant war, you must recognize that there's a need to employ other methods for our security, for our peace and welfare. The first law then, every man ought to endeavor peace or search for peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. So if you can't be at peace, you need to defend yourself. Second law, in order to achieve peace, people must be willing to give up some of their rights they enjoy in the state of nature. Third law, they need to keep their covenants. So when you make a promise, it is indestructible. That's the difference between